Hello everybody and welcome to today's video. Today I'm looking at the 2026 Senate elections and I'm looking at it through the lens of the 2018 midterm elections, and I want to talk about some really interesting points and things that I noticed when going through this scenario. So first things first, the 2026 Senate elections right now, I currently have the Democrats at 44 seats, Republicans at 46, and 10 seats are in my yellow toss-up category. Now for me, toss-up is anything that's a 5% margin of victory or under. For my current rankings, there's a few states like North Carolina and New Hampshire that may ultimately exceed that, but are right around that margin. So I want to put it in toss-up for the purpose of today's video, and I want to discuss this a little bit. So currently the polling that we have for the 2026 midterms, on the generic ballot, Democrats are currently leading 45%, Republicans are at 39.7%. That accounts for roughly about a 5.3% lead for the Democrats on the generic ballot. Now for generic congressional ballot, usually when you think of Congress, you may think of the House, but the Senate can play an important role as well. Now, there's obviously a bunch of different forecasts and predictions for the Senate map. One that I've been using a lot more frequently is the Polls Max forecast here, and they have the Democrats favored to win 48, Republicans favored to win 52, with some very close calls in places like Ohio and Maine and Georgia, North Carolina, the usual states we talk about. Today's video, and I've done a few predictions and forecasts in the last week or so this video is not going to be more about that. It's going to be more talking about what we could see for the Senate map in 2026. So first things first. Let's talk about some of these elections that have taken place recently. We can look at the 2020 Senate map where we saw a very close race. And I talk about 2020 because in 2026, Senate elections happen every 6 years. So almost all the seats that are up in 2026 are from the 2020 elections. It's that Senate cycle. You do have two more Senate races as well, though, in Florida and Ohio. Ohio, we're especially going to talk about a little bit more in depth. Now, in this Senate election as a whole, Republicans got about 49.3% of the national vote. Democrats got about 47%. So Republicans won across the entire nation by about 2.3%. And as I mentioned, the current generic ballot polling has the Democrats up about 5.3%. So when I did that math, I think it was, I have it off to the side here, it was 7.6% shift to go from that map where Republicans won by about 2.3 to the Democrats being up by about 5.3. And when I did that, just to show you in 2020 what it would look like, what that would mean would be some of these races, like Iowa, for instance, would go from about a 6.5 point win for the Republican to about a 1.1% win for the Democrat. Michigan would go from around, I think it was a 4 point or a 3 point win or something like that, and Michigan to about a 9 point Democratic win. Susan Collins, who won by, I think it was 9 points or something like that in the initial election, ends up only winning here by 1. And then you can also look at North Carolina, a state that Tom Tillis, the Republican incumbent, won, goes Democrat 5.9. Georgia's both Senate seats go in likely Democratic category. John Ossoff specifically wins by 5.8. But then it also calls into question states like Montana, which goes red by 2.4, Kansas red by 3.8, Texas only red by 2 points. Very important state we're going to have to talk about there. Alaska 5.1% as well. Now, it's a little tricky here because you could just say, well, you shifted 5.7 points. All these states are going to go blue as they are and red as they are, right? It doesn't always 100% work this way because each Senate map is a little bit different. For instance, there was a special election up in Arizona that went to the Democrats. There was a special election up in Georgia that also went to the Democrats. So there's always going to be a few special elections that are going to make each map a little bit different. And we're having that again in 2026 with Ohio and with Florida, as I mentioned. But just shifting everything that way, the Democrats would hold, I think it's 49 plus 3, so you'll hold about 52 Senate seats, and Republicans will hold about 48 in that scenario. Now I want to talk about a little bit more in depth on the 2020 Senate election map here, where we can look at, say, a state like Ohio or Iowa and see how it voted compared to the nation. So I'm about to do this for Ohio as well. So Iowa voted for Joni Ernst with 6.5%. And as I mentioned, the overall vote here for the Republicans across the nation was about 2.3. So you could look at 6.5 for Ernst, 2.3 for Republicans across the entire country. You could say Iowa voted roughly close to around 4 points or so more Republican than the national vote. Now, I want to talk about the state of Ohio because Ohio specifically, I did this for. Ohio in 2024, where Sherrod Brown was up against Bernie Moreno in this race, and the Republican Bernie Moreno ended up winning by 3.6% of the vote. The national vote overall, though, across the country was Democrat plus 1.4. This means that Ohio roughly voted to the right of the nation, Republican of the nation here. I have it by about 5%. So overall, Ohio voted 5% more red than the country in 2024. In 2022, the Senate race that J.D. Vance had, it went for Vance by 6.1%. And again, the same thing here, the national Republican vote on the Senate map here in 2022 was only Republican plus 0.1. So that would mean that Ohio voted roughly 6% more Republican than the country as a whole. So why am I bringing that up? Well, in that conversation, the national generic ballot currently is the Democrats about 5.3%. What would happen if, say, Ohio votes about 5% more red than the country as a whole? Well, just quick math here. 5.3% lead for the Democrats in generic ballot. Ohio goes 5 points more Republican than that. Ohio would actually go for Sherrod Brown by under 1% of the vote and be a Democratic win. If it's more in line with 2022, where it votes more Republican of the nation by like 6 points, then it would be a very close Republican under 1 point win. Again, it doesn't always work out this way, so it's a little complicated when you account for those special elections. But things like this could be an important indicator because you always talk about past election performance. You always talk about the current polling data of this race. But how a state votes compared to how the nation itself votes on the map is very important to look at as well. And the Senate map always is a little tricky, so you can also look at, say, the presidential map if you want to, where President Trump won the popular vote in 2024, 49.8, Kamala Harris 48.3, so around a 1.5%, 1.5% Republican win across the entire nation. You can look at a state like Michigan, which only voted a 0.1% difference between the national Trump vote and the state vote. It went 0.1% more Democratic than the nation as a whole. Pennsylvania, which went 1.7% for Donald Trump, went roughly about, 0.2% more Republican as a whole. So you can go at it that way as well. For Ohio at the presidential level, though, it was an 11.2% win for Trump. So that was 10 points more Republican nearly than what the national vote was. So what does that mean for 2026? Well, if it matched Trump's margins, it would be a win for the Republicans by a very sizable amount, and it really wouldn't be in that conversation. But it's kind of just looking at things in like a blanket way, because in Senate elections, it's interesting because in elections kind of go like this. Presidential elections obviously are the most nationalized elections we have. Everyone talks about it. Everyone has an opinion on it. Senate elections are a little bit more niche, though a lot of people still pay attention because Senate elections are very nationalized as well. But certainly there's a lot more talk about, or a lot less talk about Senate elections than the presidential races. Then you get into the House, which is also still pretty local or nationalized as well. And you talk about, well, does that help the president's party? Does it not help the president's party? Then you get into the governor elections, which are very localized a lot of the time. Sure, like you may still see Democrats always winning in like Washington or California, but there is possibilities for Republicans to win in places like Massachusetts or Vermont with the right candidates, and even New Hampshire with the right candidates as well. So it's always a little bit unpredictable on the governor's side. On the Senate side, though, I would say the candidate quality does matter in a lot of these Senate elections where the presidential ratings don't always 100% line up. And again, I can show you a clear example of this. In 2024, Donald Trump won pretty much every single swing state in Nevada and Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia. On the Senate map, though, we can even look at here, actually, probably just stay on this one. On the Senate map, Nevada went blue for the Democrat by 1.6. Arizona went Democrat 2.4. Wisconsin and Michigan were both under a point, but both stayed Democrat. Pennsylvania went for Dave McCormick, the Republican, defeating the Democratic incumbent only by 0.22%. So the Senate races don't always line up 100% with the presidential results. So when you talk about the ratings here, you could say, well, Trump won Michigan, for instance, by 1.4% in 2024. Can you just say, well, then on the Senate map, that Republican Mike Rogers should win Michigan? Well, looking at the Senate map where we saw what Rogers versus Slotkin looked like, and Slotkin ended up winning the Democrat at 0.34%. So the quality of candidate, I think, in the Senate races matters a good amount of deal here. So when you talk about a place like Ohio, Sherrod Brown is not your typical Democrat. He is a very popular Democrat and probably the best Democrat in the state of Ohio to run for Senate. And we saw this in 2024, where Moreno won by 3.6%, again about 5% more red than the country as a whole. But Donald Trump, at the top of the ticket, won Ohio by about 11 points. So from that standpoint, you're going from an 11-point Trump win down to roughly about a 3.6% win. That's an 8% difference between the presidential election and the Senate election. And that is in Ohio with Sherrod Brown. Ohio voting for Trump by about 11 points. If that were to happen in a state like Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin, where it would be like an 11-point difference because of the Democratic candidate, these states would have all gone Democratic at the Senate level and by a very healthy amount. So it's important when you talk about the context of 2026 that these shifts here are very significant. So now we can also look at the 2018 Senate map as well here, because 2018 is the midterm that always gets criticized or compared to 2026, because it is the midterm election during Donald Trump's first term, and the 2026 election environment sets the exact same type of scenario here. It's a midterm election in Trump's term. Trump's approval ratings aren't looking too strong. He's about down, I think I saw about 14% of the Decision Desk HQ average I looked at going into this. We can even look at it to just get the updated numbers here. Oh no, now Trump is down. Yeah, Trump's down about 13.2% according to their average. Looking on the 2018 Senate map here, Democrats won this map, but they won it very big. They won it by about 20 points over the Republicans. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that 2018 is probably the most pro-Democratic map that there is. When you look at all the states that are up, there's a lot more Democratic states than Republican states in this map, especially like California, where you're going to skew the numbers there on population, and Washington as well, New York, pretty much most of New England minus New Hampshire. And then the Republican states, you have a few handful of states that would vote pretty strongly Republican, but the population numbers just don't really line up. But the Democrats got the margins up and have voted about 20 points or so for the Democrats over the Republicans. Ohio in this election, this is when Sherrod Brown was the incumbent here. Before in 2024, this is his last election before that. He won here by 6.8%. Again, the map overall, though, was about a 20-point victory for the Democrats. So you're looking around, what's that, close to a 13 to 14-point shift more Republican in Ohio than the nation as a whole. So what does that, well, does that throw a wrench into the whole argument of, well, Ohio is going to go Democrat because look how much Sherrod Brown underperformed the national vote on this map? Again, I would say no, because the context here really matters, and it's sort of tricky and difficult to get into these conversations of like, well, doesn't this mean I'll just go blue? Well, no, because look at the map as well. You had lean Democrat in Montana, lean Democrat West Virginia with Joe Manchin. You had Democratic states in New Jersey. You had Pennsylvania, Bob Casey won by 13 points. Michigan, 6.5% for Debbie Stabenow, 11 points for Tammy Baldwin, and Wisconsin. We're probably not going to see margins like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania again for a Senate race, probably in a pretty long time. Michigan, 6.5%, I would say is a little bit more reasonable. I don't know if it's going to happen in 2026 or not, but if everything broke the Democrats' way, it certainly could. And then New York, 34 points for Kirsten Gillibrand. This was like a perfect storm where the Democrats did everything perfectly. Now in 2026, it's the same midterm environment. So you could say, well, couldn't this also mean the Democrats could win the Senate map by 20 points? And the reason I would say that's not the most likely is the Senate map is a lot more Republican friendly in 2026 than the 2018 map. So Democrats are going to point to 2018 and say, well, we should do very well because it's another Trump midterm. But I think expectations should be tempered a little bit because it's going to be a much more Republican favorable Senate map than 2018 was. But there is some overlap in some of these races, though. Ohio is up like it was in 2018. That's going to be a very important one to watch. Michigan's going to be a big one. It was a 6.5% win in 2018 for the Democrats over the Republicans. Now that's going to be an important battleground state to watch. Georgia does not have a seat in 2018, or North Carolina or New Hampshire, but Texas did. This was the Ted Cruz Beto O'Rourke race, where Cruz only won by 2.6%. Nevada and Arizona don't have races. Montana does, though, with John Tester not running in the race. I don't know if it's going to fall under that same category, especially with the independent and Democrat both running in the race here. So are the Democrats going to win the Senate map overall across the entire country by 20 points? Obviously, the answer to that is no. But we can look a little bit closely at the 2018 elections as a whole, though. And let's see, can look at the House level and see how the Democrats overall did across the House, and this may give us an indicator. Democrats got about 53.4% of the vote. Republicans got about 44.8%. So let's just do quick math here, and I want to get it's roughly about 9 points, but I just have my calculator here. I'm just going to add it up because I want to get as accurate as possible for you here. That's about an 8.6% win on the House level, which could be compared to the generic ballot. So 8.6% on the House side of things. So let's say it matches exactly that in the 2020 Senate map, which is going to be for the 2026 midterms. Again, minus Florida and Ohio, which may skew the numbers a little bit. But let's take the shift here. We'll go to the Democrats, and we're going to shift the Senate map by about 8.6% to get to that margin. If they did, this is what the map would currently look like. It would have the Democrats winning Iowa by about 2.1%. It would have Michigan going Democrat about 10.3%. North Carolina would go Democratic about 6.9%. Georgia would go Democrat 6.8%. Maine going Democrat by just like the smallest of margins possible. You're looking at like 12 vote difference here in Maine if that happened. You also have New Hampshire would be over 20 points because Jeanne Shaheen just totally crushed her Republican opponent in that race. But Kansas would only be a 3-point Republican win. Mississippi a 1.4% Republican win. John Cornyn, who won this race by like 10 points in 2020, Texas would only be about 1 point. Alaska would only be about 4 points. And then Montana would be about 1.4. So based on how the House map looked in 2018, compare that to the 2026 Senate map and what it could do, you're looking more, I would say, at a map that, again, this is certainly a very good scenario for the Democrats as you're seeing Iowa and Maine and Michigan, North Carolina, and Georgia all going blue here. But when you look at a lot of the polling data currently going on in these races, it's not super unrealistic, especially when you compare it to, say, the map from, not the 2021 because we already did that, but we can even look at, say, the 2018 map where the Democrats, for instance, were winning West Virginia, Montana, Ohio by a lot, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania by a good amount. We know it's probably not going to play out 100% that way, but seeing the map here where Georgia is likely Democrat, we can look at the polling data right now on PollsMax side here. That's the forecast. Look at the polling. And Georgia is currently in the polling average for Ossoff about 4.1. North Carolina, Roy Cooper's up 7.9. Ohio has John Husted up 2.8. But Iowa, Ashley Hinson's only up by 1 point. Maine, Graham Plattner's up 0.5. Michigan, the Democrat Abdul Al-Sayed's up 1.7. New Hampshire is currently 5.6% for Chris Pappas. Texas is currently 1.7% for Ken Paxton. And Alaska is 0.9% for Dan Sullivan over Mary Peltola. You're looking at this map here, and at very least, based on what we've seen from a lot of the polling and from the factors heading into this race, it's not really the most unrealistic scenario. New Mexico, which also doesn't have a Republican opponent in this scenario, is also just a hair under 15 points. Well, no, it'll be more than 15 points for sure. But that doesn't even factor in a place like Nebraska, where now Dan Osborne came on strong in 2024 and will be running again in 2026. So when you compare it to how the House voted in that 2018 midterm election, you're looking at something where the Democrats would get, 3 more Senate seats, it looks like. So it'd be 53 seats for the Democrats and 47 for the Republicans. Now, just the math here is going to be tough because Democrats start at 44, Republicans start at 46. If the Democrats won everything, they would get to 54 Senate seats. If the Republicans won everything, they'd get to 56. I don't think we're going to see something like that happen. I think we're going to see a bit of a scenario where Republicans win some areas, Democrats win some areas. Just going through a quick scenario, what this could look like. Let's say John Ossoff holds Georgia and Democrats and Chris Pappas holds New Hampshire. Democrats are up to 46. Let's say, hypothetically, that Roy Cooper picks up North Carolina, is looking very strong here. Democrats up to 47. Polls were looking good for the Republicans early on versus Abdul Al-Sayed in Michigan. Now I think he's either leading in the polling average or just like less than like 1 point behind on the Wikipedia one. Let's give Democrats Michigan. Democrats are now at 48. Republicans are at 46. Republicans, even though Dan Osborne's a very strong candidate, are pretty bullish about keeping Nebraska. We'll give them that state. Iowa, the polls have been super close for Josh Strack and Ashley Hinson. Iowa's polling, though, was always a little bit wonky. Iowa voted about, what was that, like a 13-point win for Donald Trump. Let's give the Republicans Iowa. 48-48. Then you come down to Alaska, Texas, Ohio, and Maine. And these states, obviously, we know how close these are going to be. Both parties would argue they're ahead in these races here. Let's say we'll give Graham Plattner the very slight edge in Maine. Let's say he pulls that race out. In Ohio, let's say Sherrod Brown versus John Husted, another close, like super close race. Actually, we'll come back to Ohio. Let's just say Texas for now. Ken Paxton finds a way to hold on. Alaska, Mary Peltola versus Dan Sullivan. You can go either way here. You could say if you wanted to come down to the Senate majority, you can give Peltola Alaska 50 Democrats. Republicans are at 49. Technically, Republicans have the 50-50 tiebreak with the vice president, so Ohio would have to be a Democratic win for Sherrod Brown to flip the Senate 51-49, or if the Republicans hold it, it'd be a 50-50 Senate race. But based on those same House numbers from 2018, if they were to match, Iowa would be a 2.1% win for the Democrats. So based on those results, just everything else being equal, Democrats would then get up to 51-49. And going off those same numbers, Ohio would also be a narrow flip as well. And Texas would either be a very narrow Republican win or it would be a narrow Democratic flip. So those House numbers from 2018, everyone's going to look at the Senate map and be like, well, the Senate map was like a 20-point Democratic win. I think the House numbers are something more that Republicans and Democrats should pay attention to, where it was roughly like a, what I say it was, but an 8.6% or 8.4% margin here. I think it was 8.6. That's the number I'd be watching in terms of the generic ballot and how it lines up, was that House result from 2018. And if that played out that way, Democrats would have a conceivable path to flipping the Senate. Now, to do so, they would have to win several Trump plus 10 states like Alaska, Texas, Iowa, and even Ohio from 2024. But again, the Senate and the presidential election results seem to be very different. Even in 2024, it told us that, where Wisconsin and Michigan, Nevada and Arizona all voted narrowly Democrat, even when Trump won these states at the top of the ticket. And Pennsylvania came very close to following suit in that same category. And Ohio was like 7 points down of the margin that Trump won it by. So in terms of what things are looking at for 2026, 2018 could potentially give us a clue here. Maybe not so much on the Senate side of those results, but how the House voted of roughly about an 8.6% win for the Democrats. If things follow suit in 2018, there's a real possibility Democrats could flip control of the U.S. Senate in 2026 if things play out the exact same way that they did back then. Even with a different Senate map that doesn't exactly line up the same way as 2018's does, if the House vote overall is the same, there's a real chance Democrats could flip the Senate. Now, will that happen? I always say we're the beginning of July of 2026. The election's held in November. A few months is a lifetime in politics, so you never know. Things may get a lot closer. Maybe things get better for President Trump and the Republicans, or maybe things get worse and Democrats even have stronger chances. Maybe it becomes clear that they're going to flip the Senate in maybe places like Nebraska, Montana, Kansas, maybe even Mississippi, Florida, or South Carolina fall under that category of potentially flipping. It's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting scenario on these 2026 Senate elections. I'm interested in what you think. Leave your thoughts in the comment section all down below. For now, though, that is it. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to hit like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you in a future video.